tradition, as all intercollegiate clubs at Oxford were at that time and still are today. It was a requirement that there be a senior member of the university associated with the student club for it to have legitimacy. I don't know if this was an outrageous piece of in loco parentis or what. But in any case, the first president of that club was C.S. Lewis, who served in that position until 1954, when he took a position in Cambridge. The second president was someone who I knew when I was a student in Oxford, and that was Basil Mitchell, who was for many years the philosopher, the professor of philosophy of religion, though the club had disbanded the year before I arrived there. The purpose of the original Socratic Club was to give a forum in which intellectual challenges raised by the Christian religion and intellectual challenges to the Christian religion could be heard in an open setting, basically with no holds barred in terms of argument and give and take. And we have tried to do the same. We're going to follow the following format today. I have a few remarks to make here at the beginning, and then Dr. Kries will offer us some remarks of his, followed by David Calhoun, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. I have very briefly 5 talking points I want to lay down in terms of the Vagina Monologues and their presence on Catholic universities. This is in no particular order of importance. The first point is this: not all forms of pluralism are worth having. In particular, a mere smorgasbord approach, whether it's to a religious tradition or an intellectual tradition or both, is a recipe for disaster, and in particular for deep and profound conceptual confusions. Second point: the 3 great traditions of Christianity, the Protestant tradition, the Catholic tradition, and the Orthodox tradition, can be distinguished to a considerable extent in terms of their principles of authority. Protestantism is defined by a principle of authority which makes primary private judgment in most matters of faith and practice. By contrast, Catholic Christianity is characterized by a firm sense of the teaching magisterium of the Church, which is primarily composed of the bishops of the Church in conjunction with the Pope. The Orthodox tradition in Christianity has a similar principle of authority, similar to the Catholic tradition, but places more emphasis on tradition than it does on bodies of bishops and other prelates meeting in concert. And the principle of these different principles of authority, I think, have some bearing on some of the questions that will arise in Dr. Kries's comments and Dr. Calhoun's comments later on. My third point is that science is not just one voice among many in universities, a point which I think Aristotle knew and understood very well. Our best scientific knowledge carries a weight and an authority above and all other voices in the university, or at least within the university understood in a naturalistic sense. One of the reasons that Catholic universities often draw as heavily as they do on philosophers and on the philosophical traditions of the West is precisely because Catholicism is deeply devoted, root and branch, to the view that science and religion are compatible with one another, and that this compatibility is to be searched out and followed wherever it leads. My fourth point is simply that narratives, as such, have no essential connection with the promotion of social justice. I have in mind here a number of counterexamples to the view that they might have such an essential connection. Some of you will be familiar with a personal and political narrative which dominated the life of Germany between 1933 and 1945. It was captured in the book written by Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. That book is a long narrative that was the foundation for Nazi propaganda about the alleged worldwide Jewish conspiracy to rule the world on behalf of communistic Bolshevism, a narrative which was foundational for some of the most horrific crimes of the 20th century. It happens that severe forms of psychopathology are often accompanied by narratives, what we might call psychobiological narratives, many of which are also hardly likely to promote social justice. It is not the telling of stories as such that promotes social justice, though the telling of some stories might do so. Finally, a two-part talking point that also has some connection to my own personal views about the Vagina Monologues. Should the Vagina Monologues be presented on a Catholic campus? Is there an obligation to do so? It seems to me clearly that there is no obligation to do so. Though I myself am much in favor of universities having an all-comers policy when it comes to the presentation of controversial points of view on a university campus. I would allow anyone to present any point of view about any issue. On the other hand, it is perfectly clear that Catholic universities do have an obligation to follow the official and received teachings of the Catholic Church, especially in matters of human sexuality and other areas of the practice of religious life. Insofar as we are a Catholic university, we are officially obligated by our mandate from the local bishop to sponsor and to follow those teachings. Since I'm not a Catholic, I often find this very uncomfortable, but there it is. That does seem to me to be an inescapable obligation. Finally, concerning the Vagina Monologues themselves, I've seen the monologues produced twice and have read them at least twice, though it's now about 5 or 6 years since I last saw the most recent revision of the monologues. My own view is that the monologues have two very serious faults, and I hope that these are things we can consider in the light of subsequent remarks in our discussion. One of them is they seem to me to have a very odd view of the very complex nature of human sexuality. And I would hate for anybody to go away from the monologues thinking that this was somehow an authoritative picture of human sexuality. Secondly, it seems to me that the mainsprings of the empowerment of women have a great deal more to do with access to political power and economic power than they have to do with sexuality. Those are my talking points. I hope that some of these were taken up in discussion later on. And now, if you will, please give your attention to Dr. Kries.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to all for coming today. I'm going to begin by admitting that when I was originally invited by the Socratic Club to participate in this conversation, I was initially disinclined. I was thinking that, well, I have little respect for the Vagina Monologues. Well, why do I want to be involved in this controversy? If some people want to chant about genitalia, it is at least better for me if they do so within the confines of a theater than out on the quad in proximity to my classroom window, which is what they were doing before. I'm not joking. Besides, my wife, who is in her 31st year, working in various Catholic high schools, assures me that mostly what this is all about is the desire, so typical of adolescents, for attracting attention to themselves. If this is simply ignored, she counsels, the whole thing will dissolve soon enough. What finally dissuaded me from listening to my wife, even though it always turns out badly when I don't, was what dissuaded me was reflecting on my students. Within the last several years, I've noticed that my classroom has become increasingly feminine. So much so that, at present, in my 2 upper division courses this term, courses for which students are more able to choose for themselves, a full 3/4 of the students are women. And in one section, the percentage is over 80. Not only are these female students far more numerous than their male counterparts, but they tend to re-enroll for subsequent courses. And they earn the best marks, too. I should like to think that this feminizing phenomenon in my philosophy courses is due to my dashing good looks. I honestly fear, on the other hand, that it may have rather more to do with the fact that college men are falling behind college women in reading ability, and I tend to emphasize reading in my courses. A lot of the women, though, tell me that they take my courses for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with me at all. They are simply interested in the arguments of classical Christian theism. Some of these young women are disappointed that Gonzaga now sponsors these monologues, and since they are my best students and members of the vast majority of my students, without whom I don't know how I could justify my continued employment at the university, it seems to me that I have something of an obligation to participate in the discussion. The question is whether sponsoring this monologues is necessitated by the GU mission, as the advocates of sponsorship were claiming last spring. The justification that was given for answering this question in the affirmative was that the monologues raised consciousness about the evils of abusive sexual behavior toward women. But of course, if that were all the monologues were about, they wouldn't be controversial at all. Everyone would be in favor of them, but few people would attend the performances, and discussions such as this one wouldn't garner much of an audience. Indeed, I wish that that were all these monologues were about, because I have a wife and 2 daughters, and as I said, a great many female students, and I would very much like to be able to join forces with all those who are opposed to abusive treatment of women. If this were really all about sexual abuse of women, and we were looking for a quality literary treatment of the matter, I would recommend Tom Wolfe's I Am Charlotte Simmons as being far more worthy simply on literary grounds. Wolfe's novel revolves around a date rape. Its setting is a college campus, a private college campus, one featuring a drinking culture, a hookup culture, and a top-tier NCAA basketball program. No, the setting of Wolfe's novel is not Gonzaga. He uses a fictitious name for his school, but it is widely rumored that Duke University was the model. One GU student, however, who has read the novel, tells me that it depicts a school that differs from Gonzaga, but only in degree and not in kind. So I would agree that Gonzaga needs some serious consciousness raising about a whole array of pathologies, and the treatment of women by men is certainly high on the list. But why is it necessary to choose for this task a literary work so offensive to so many who might otherwise be willing to help? But what was particularly discouraging to me about the claims made by the monologue supporters last spring was that the claim that the monologues are necessary for GU because the Catholic Church is a wicked patriarchal institution with a long history of nothing but suppressing and silencing women. To be sure, I have no desire to deny but that within Christ's church there are plenty of sinners. Indeed, there are only sinners. The neurotic comedian Woody Allen used to quip that he would never want to belong to a club that would accept someone like himself for a member. Needless to say, Mr. Allen has yet to enter the church. Nor do I wish to deny that some of these many sins within the church include sins against women. My own aforementioned wife has been harmed by such sins, and in fact, she lives during the week in Seattle, making gains for the church there rather than for the church in Spokane, because Catholics working within the church's schools there are willing to listen to the prudent counsel of women, whereas at least some Catholics working within the church's schools in Spokane are not. but still, one would expect a fair, if critical, treatment of the church from Gonzaga University. And a fair treatment yields a much more favorable view of the church than the jaundiced one that was offered last spring. Let us begin by attempting a fair, if necessarily brief, treatment of St. Augustine, who has been maligned as a woman-hater in these discussions. Indeed, tide permitting, I could cite texts in which Augustine says bad things about women. The gist of his concern is that women sometimes lack tenacity. Too quick to desire to please others, they sometimes succumb to inconstancy and abandon truth. Of course, Augustine says far worse things about men, himself included, and their tendency to immoderation and the arrogance that such immoderation engenders. But let's consider the principal ways in which Augustine affected the lives of women. First, in elevating the text of Genesis 1:27 about the creation of the male and the female in the image of God, and marginalizing Paul's comment at 1 Corinthians 11:7 about the man being the image of God and the woman being the glory of the man, Augustine established the basic pattern of Christian interpretation that would prevail in the church. Second, in writing his Confessions, he elevates the status of Monica, his mother, from a very unimportant woman, from a very backwater African town, into the heroine of the most famous Christian narrative ever composed. Compare the role of Monica in the Confessions with the women in the narrative that the Confessions was intended to and did replace, Virgil's Aeneid. Thirdly, consider Augustine's writings on marriage. By insisting on the good of marriage, by explaining not only how marriage could help heal the sins of men and women, but even be a sacramentum, a symbol for the love between Christ and the church, Augustine altered the very nature of marriage and profoundly improved the prospects of women who do marry. Finally, by reforming the monastic way of life and providing for the establishment of a common Christian life for women as well as for men, he made it possible for a great many poor women to improve their meager prospects in the world. In terms of real consequences, Augustine did more to improve the lot of women in the ancient world than any other human being who lived in the whole of the ancient period. One can say this even without listing the smaller, immediate things that he did through his office as bishop. Writing to encourage a young woman in her studies, responding to requests for counsel made by a struggling abbess, using church properties to buy back young women who had been sold into sexual trafficking schemes, insisting on the superiority of Christian rhetoric to imperial rhetoric, because the former was used to educate both sexes in the sermons of the church, whereas the latter was used only for the ambitions of males. Of course, Augustine would be the first to admit that if his intellectual and rhetorical powers helped to make a dent in the long narrative of human sinfulness, the credit should go to God and not to himself. But it seems to me that if God is willing to pour out that much grace on his church, the proper response should be tremendous gratitude on the part of men and women alike. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over similarly misleading remarks the advocates of the monologues have made about Thomas Aquinas and turn instead to contemporary times. Within the last few months, I have come across the stories of three rather remarkable women. Abby Johnson worked within the abortion wing of Planned Parenthood for many years before a recent reconversion. Now, Claiming that society owes women something better than abortion, she has become a leading voice in the pro-life movement. She spoke in Spokane last spring, but of course not at Gonzaga, as we were preoccupied with the monologues. Teresa Tomeo worked in the communications industry as a television and radio reporter for many years. She has recently published a book titled Extreme Makeover: Women Transformed by Christ, Not Conformed to the Culture. I still have a few chapters to go, but the book seems to be ably described by this sentence from its blurb, quote, "Packed with not only persuasive statistics, but also powerful personal testimonies, Extreme Makeover shows that it is not the slogans of the sexual revolution and the women's liberation movement that free and dignify women, but the beautiful teachings of the Catholic Church," unquote. And then, last Sunday, I happened to hear at Christ the King Parish in Seattle a short talk by Teresa Deischer, PhD in molecular and cellular physiology, Stanford, and leading researcher in stem cell therapies, who first identified the stem cells within the human heart. Dr. Deischer is also the founder of Sound Choice Pharmaceutical Institute, which is developing a certification program that would clarify for consumers which vaccines, medicines, and cosmetics have been developed without experimentation on the remains of elective abortions. All three of these women tell a similar story about their lives. Begins with a timid, ineffective religious education, usually at a Christian high school, where people seemed afraid or unwilling to articulate the church's teaching on sexual morality. A subsequent fall during the college years into the culture of sex for pleasure alone, the culture of sex outside marriage, the culture of abortion, and all the rest. This is followed by a rejection of what they perceive as the false promises of the women's liberation movement, and a turn to the Roman Catholic Church, for which they are exceedingly grateful, except to say that the church should be far more confident in its teaching about sexual morality. Well, if the Vagina Monologues are somehow necessary for Gonzaga's mission, wouldn't a set of monologues done by these or similar women be far more necessary to Gonzaga's mission? In concluding, I consider a final example, and here I am in danger of being tempted to anger. The advocates of the Vagina Monologues last spring appealed, as implying that the monologues are necessary for the mission of Gonzaga University, to the writings of John Paul II. I find that I have no respect whatsoever for the claim that the author of Dignitatis Mulieribus, on the dignity of women, would be an advocate for something that so reduces the dignity of women. But this gives rise to a really outrageous proposition. What if those who claim to be attentive to the GU mission brought to our attention something actually written on the dignity of women by John Paul himself? What if we were asked to read Dignitatis Mulieribus rather than the Vagina Monologues? As a result of this, I simply ask, how did Gonzaga University, a Catholic university, a Jesuit university, a university whose patron had a deeply developed devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, a university whose patron was the prize student of Robert Bellarmine, about the ablest defender of the papacy one could imagine. How, I ask, could Gonzaga University manage to get itself into a position wherein the Vagina Monologues receive the support of the university's administration, much of its faculty, and, I guess, many of its students? Yet the words of one of the church's most remarkable popes in this or any age, including words insisting on the dignity of women, be generally considered beyond the pale. Finally, I note that despair, according to the teaching of the church, is a sin. But I confess I don't have a lot of hope that those in authoritative positions are even aware that we have a serious mission problem. So I return for my hope to those female students I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, who, despite what Augustine may have thought, display a great tenacity for independent thinking. I point out that Teresa Tomeo's book can be downloaded for about $10. You can put it on Kindle. Your Right to Life Club doesn't have much of a budget, but perhaps Teresa Deischer would do a pro bono talk. I've recently purchased a copy of the critical edition of John Paul II's Theology of the Body, collection of papal audiences that he delivered over a great many years, intending to read it, but my wife is not well and won't be well for some time, so I don't have time to read it just now, so I'm willing to loan it. And finally, I note that I will be offering a course on St. Augustine next spring, despite the harsh words of his Gonzaga detractors. I believe registration begins November 1st. Yes, men too are permitted to enroll, if they can squeeze in before the female students take all the seats. Thank you.
Wow, that's a difficult presentation to follow. Thank you, Dr. Kries. If you don't have the handouts, there are copies floating around somewhere, so you might just ask somebody next to you. The classic authoritative studies of religious identity in American higher education are George Marsden's The Soul of the American University, From Protestant Establishment to Established Nonbelief, and The Dying of the Light, The Disengagement of Colleges and Universities from Their Christian Churches, by Father Frank Tunstall Burchell. These sources show clearly that institutions that do not actively and affirmatively nurture their religious identity and mission inevitably drift away from that mission toward neutralism and eventually secularization. They further show that this process is rarely the product of insistent and dedicated secularists moving the institution away from its religious character. Rather, the shift is typically an incremental process driven by well-meaning, often deeply religious faculty and administrators who repeatedly assert the rights and perquisites of academic freedom against the strictures of institutional church sponsors. In April 2011, as we've already been talking about, Gonzaga University officially hosted a performance of Eve Ensler's Vagina Monologues. In my view, the controversies provoked by this university decision reflect a wider crisis of identity and mission at Gonzaga. If Marsden and Burchell are right, as I believe their evidence demonstrates, the mission and identity of an institution of higher education are embodied in its faculty and administration, its curriculum and programs, especially its core curriculum, which, by the way, at Gonzaga is under review right now, its co-curricular activities, and the public face it presents to the community, especially parents of prospective students, alumni, and donors. As such, an officially sanctioned performance of the Vagina Monologues is only a minor part of the entire way that Gonzaga represents itself and conceives of itself. So I'd like to say a few things about mission and the monologues, which pretty quickly will move away from the monologues to larger issues. First, there are far better tools to highlight and critically respond to violence against women than the Vagina Monologues. I'd like first to second Dr. Kries' recommendation that you read I Am Charlotte Simmons. I've thought about using it for courses here at Gonzaga, except for the fact that it is so brutal and graphic in describing sexuality in college campuses, which suggests to me that brutality and graphic content are not the problem. Obviously, people, when they talk about the controversies posed by the Vagina Monologues, they typically mention that it's graphic and brutal. That's not the problem, as I see it. Proponents of the Vagina Monologues argue, in keeping with author Eve Ensler's very successful PR campaign, that the play is a protest against violence against women. Of course, proponents defend the play on other grounds as well. For example, in the spring, a faculty-student panel enthusiastically endorsed the monologues as a piece of consciousness-raising political theater, a weapon to shatter societal sexual taboos, a valuable means for challenging institutional Roman Catholic patriarchy and hegemony, a way to hear the silenced voices of women, and a way to stand in Christian solidarity and love with those who have been harmed by violence. Others suggested, and this alludes to the point that Dr. Kries was making toward the end of his talk, others suggested that the play offered an essential way for us to live out the Jesuit mission of bringing the gospel to the edges of culture, or following the instruction of Pope John Paul II in seeking the truth on matters of controversy. I find the Vagina Monologues a poor tool for promoting critical inquiry into violence against women or the silencing of women's voices. I have many reasons for this judgment, among which I would include the following. This is just a bullet point list. We can talk more about it if you want to, but this is just brief bullet points. Many of the individual monologues do not even address violence. Some monologues are awkward and rather juvenile attempts to generate humor by repeated pronouncements of forbidden words, while others are goofy attempts to normalize conversation about genitalia. My favorite example of that is, which hat would your vagina wear? I'm not kidding. That's one of the monologues if you don't know the content.
I promise you that's not one. I have the entire play memorized. There's nothing about the hats.
The women's voices that we hear are filtered through the interests, questions, authorial objectives, political motivations, and editorial intervention of Eve Ensler rather than being allowed to speak for themselves. A vast range of female voices is silenced by omission. The overall theme of the Vagina Monologues is not so much violence against women as sexual liberation and the rejection of basic tenets of traditional sexual morality and Christian teaching on human good and sexuality. The focus on genitalia objectifies women and reduces female identity to sexuality and sexual activity. Even defenders of the play frequently admit that the play is of poor literary quality. Much of the rhetoric about the play consists of exuberant and sophomoric attempts to shock the bourgeoisie, including parents, I would say. The play targets all manner of social taboos without acknowledging that some taboos protect human dignity. For these reasons and many more, I conclude that there are many texts and sources that offer far better educational potential to address violence against women than do the Vagina Monologues. Second point, at the very least, public presentation of events such as the monologues cries out for a critical academic framing. When the performance of the Vagina Monologues was announced by the Gonzaga administration in the spring, we were assured that the performance would be part of, quote, an interdisciplinary academic exploration, end quote. In particular, we were promised that the events of the spring would together constitute an impartial search for truth, of the sort envisioned by John Paul II in Ex Corde Ecclesia, and focused on the relationship between, quote, the issue of violence against women and themes of Catholic theologies of the body and Catholic teaching on sexuality. As it turned out, however, the performance of the Vagina Monologues on Sunday evening was preceded by a panel of speakers who enthusiastically endorsed the performance of the play, and then by a second event linking storytelling to social justice. Neither event raised any objections or criticisms of the play in any formal way, nor did they place the play into a critical academic framework. Many people expected a talk scheduled a week after the play to provide some balance. The talk was described on a number of occasions as treating Catholic theology of the body, which led many to anticipate something like John Paul II's well-known philosophy of the body and sexuality. The AVP formally advertised, the academic vice president, formally advertised the event as a guest lecture by Dr. James Halstead, OSA of DePaul University, on the topic of, quote, Catholic perspectives on violence and broken bodies. In the end, however, Father Halstead spoke instead on pluralism in Catholic universities, about which I'll say more in a moment. In the end, therefore, there was not a single formal statement of Catholic teaching on human sexuality presented along with the performance of the monologues. Though at the panel on Monday evening, a bibliography including some authoritative church documents was available for distribution, although no one referred to it in the course of the panel. It's hard to see how there is a genuine academic conversation seeking the truth when the teaching of the church is not even allowed to present one voice among many in an academic conversation. I think that hosting an officially sanctioned performance of the Vagina Monologues outside of a critical academic framework is bad pedagogy and irresponsible exercise of academic freedom, about which I'll say more in a moment. For in performing the play, we do not equip our students to see what might be constructive or destructive about it. Instead, we invite them to consume it as rhetorical subjects carried along by its emotive power. This is not education, it is consciousness raising, or what we might call propaganda. Third point, academic freedom requires critical judgment about educational aims and methods and must be exercised in a responsible way. The academic freedom that Gonzaga faculty and students enjoy is a commission to seek the truth by exploring ideas critically. However, academic freedom is not and never has been a blanket license to do or say anything whatsoever in an academic context. Although I have to say there are people who conceive of academic freedom in these terms. Faculty limit themselves by multiple judgments of practicality, pedagogy, professionalism, and ethics in choosing how best to promote critical reflection on the part of our students. We encourage study of controversial and painful topics, such as racism, sexual violence, and injustice, but professional practice demands that we avoid needless controversy and offense when doing so. Investigation of human sexuality does not justify live on-stage demonstrations of sex toys, as actually happened at Northwestern University this past spring. Just as academic study of racism does not require public readings of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. If you're not familiar, it's a notoriously racist word. Responsible exercise of academic freedom therefore requires informed professional judgment. Fourth point, mission and identity should be conceived less as a set of rules about what is censored or restricted, and more in terms of what an institution stands for and promotes. Opposition to performance of the Vagina Monologues and other controversial events is often attacked as censorship, with the suggestion that any such opposition is a violation of academic freedom. My view that the university should not officially sanction events such as the Vagina Monologues does not commit me to the charge that the Vagina Monologues should be banned. In fact, I regard that charge as laughable. I couldn't ban the Vagina Monologues if I wanted to. And Gonzaga, as an institution, couldn't ban the Vagina Monologues if it wanted to, if that means preventing students from having access to it. Let's be clear about that. When I teach, I do not ban texts that I refrain from choosing to use in my courses. Students are free to consult and study them as they wish, and to bring the ideas they find in them into the classroom as they're appropriate. The Vagina Monologue should have exactly the same status as any other such text. I think it's helpful here to appeal to an analogy to library collections. When libraries collect materials, they cannot include every publication published, even by major academic publishers, much less every volume ever issued by every trade, vanity, and independent press. Instead, a university library typically collects in areas that reflect the strengths and emphases of the university, its programs, and ultimately its identity. For example, our own library here at Gonzaga, the Foley Center, features collections particularly strong in philosophy and philosophical theology, especially Catholic neo-Thomist thought, as a result of the fact that the library of the old St. Michael's Institute was donated to the university library when St. Michael's Institute closed in 1997, and also given that some of these collection emphases have been continued. It's not surprising that a Jesuit Catholic university would emphasize holdings in Catholicism, in Catholic philosophy, and in the history of the Society of Jesus. On this model, Jesuit Catholic identity, or more broadly, any identity assumed by an institution, has to do with more the positive emphases that the institution chooses to make in its choices, recommendations, and actions than it does in those events or choices that it declines to make. The problem here is really one of pluralism, which Dr. McClelland has already raised. If there are many voices in an institution, the identity of the institution is threatened by the multiplicity of directions and priorities of individual members. Without a committed cohort in the institution, such as a critical mass of members of the Society of Jesus, which Gonzaga increasingly does not have, or it's declining. The total number, Father Mather in the back is simply saying it's essentially kaput in terms of a cohort that has a causal effect on the
How
identity.
many Jesuits this semester are teaching at Gonzaga who are under the age of 60 who are tenured or tenure track? How many do you think?
One.
One.
So there you go. So without such a committed cohort, or without fundamental agreement among the institutional community about what the emphases are, analogous to the library collection, the inevitable tendency will be in the direction of neutralism or eventually secularism. Here, Marsden and Burchell have demonstrated the trajectory, and we've seen it historically occur over and over and over again in higher education. As I've mentioned already, a promised talk on Catholic theology of the body morphed into a presentation by Vincentian Father Halstead of DePaul University on pluralism in Catholic universities. So Father Halstead was addressing this problem that I'm trying to talk about here. Halstead's recommendation is that Catholic identity cannot be imposed on an institution by a cohort, by authorities, by anyone, but instead must take the form of engaged conversation with the institutional community. The problem with such a view is that when there is fundamental disagreement about what Catholic is, what Jesuit is, or even the degree to which the Jesuit Catholic tradition should inform and guide the institution, the conversation will be confusing rather than enlightening. It is hard to see how secularism will not be the end result of such an approach. I think fifth point. Finally, Gonzaga needs a robust, honest, and I would emphasize informed discussion about Jesuit Catholic humanist identity and mission. And this is an echo of the final points that Dr. Kries made. In my experience, authoritative pronouncements of Jesuit identity, Catholic identity, and higher education at Gonzaga are typically treated in one of three ways. One, they're ignored. Two, they're invoked in superficial ways to justify courses of action that are diametrically opposed to those authoritative statements. Or three, they're employed as near vacuous buzzwords to inspire or pacify internal and external constituencies. I want to give an example of each of these, because I've seen, and I'm sure other people could give examples of this as well. An example of the first, ignoring the authoritative statements completely. As I mentioned, Gonzaga is currently reviewing the core curriculum. The Society of Jesus has formally said in a document that any discussion about what Jesuit identity means at an institution of higher education must begin with a conversation at the community level of ex corde ecclesia. I don't think I have to tell you that no such conversation has ever taken place at Gonzaga. So that's first point, ignoring. Second example, use of authoritative statements about Jesuit and Catholic identity in justifying positions or goals that are opposed to what the authoritative statements say. I think the invocation of John Paul II and other church documents to justify the Vagina Monologues is an example of that. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. The third, the use of buzzwords. I think the best example of that is the repeated allusions that we find to social justice in internal discussions at Gonzaga and external PR materials. Though the term has been treated, I'm borrowing an idea from my colleague, Dr. Tkach here, who speaks of social justice reductionism, where we have the term and the concept that is completely removed from its philosophical and theological moorings. And so, who's against social justice? Who could possibly be against social justice? Nobody. Well, of course, in the context of a Jesuit Catholic university, though, what social justice means is shaped by philosophical and theological commitments, and yet we never hear any mention of those things. So social justice has become a slogan, a buzzword. So let me go back to number two. The second, use of authoritative statements, since they're most clearly at work in the present controversy that we're dealing with. Some faculty members have argued that the Vagina Monologues are essential to promotion of Jesuit Catholic mission. Most of us are aware that Jesuit Catholic mission means wildly different things to different people. At the panel preceding the performance of the Vagina Monologues on that Monday proceeding, a Jesuit faculty member of Gonzaga argued that the play was necessary for Jesuit mission and cited as an authoritative source Benedict XVI's address of instruction to the Society of Jesus as the most recent general congregation. The faculty member pointed out that Benedict recalls the view of Paul VI that the task of the Jesuits is to bring the gospel into confrontation with human culture, particularly at the frontiers or extremes of the human condition. Of course, many Gonzaga faculty members and administrators will likely reject Benedict's articulation of Jesuit mission. I mean, I can't do anything about that, but a lot of people just say Benedict doesn't know what he's talking about. However, in this case, it's pretty clear that core Jesuit texts reflect the same basic goals as in this document that, in this speech that Benedict gave to the society. The basic goals are evangelization, service of the church and its teaching, and promotion of faith and justice. So I want to look at a little more closely at this document and measure it against the goals, even the goals of what the proponents of the monologues say that it's all about. In the talk, Benedict concretizes the task of bringing the gospel into confrontation with human culture in a series of ways. He reminds the society that it was founded for the defense and propagation of the faith. He calls them to attest to the profound harmony, I'm quoting passages here. He calls them to attest to, quote, the profound harmony between faith and reason, between the gospel spirit, the thirst for justice and initiatives for peace, end quote. And he urges the society to, quote, renewed commitment to promoting and defending Catholic doctrine, especially against the attacks of secular culture and the values associated with it, such as, I'm quoting again here, I should be more clear about where my breaks are. But so we want to urge the society to, quote, renewed commitment to promoting and defending Catholic culture, end quote, especially against the attacks of secular culture and the values associated with it, such as, quote, subjectivism, relativism, hedonism, and practical materialism, end quote. I could go on, but this gives you a picture of what the speech is all about. Measured against this set of mission tasks, an officially sanctioned performance of the Vagina Monologue seems at best irrelevant to the mission and at worst diametrically opposed to it. According to its own defenders, performance of the Vagina Monologues, among other things, liberates viewers from social taboos regarding sexuality and female identity, reveals the bankruptcy of traditional sexual morality, and helps expose the Catholic Church as a fundamentally corrupt institution. By the testimony of its defenders, performance of the Vagina Monologues undermines rather than promotes Jesuit mission. In a critically important passage of this address of instruction, I'm not going to say a lot about the detail, but this passage strikes me as really important. It seems that Benedict speaks not only to the society, but to Gonzaga. Quote, while you seek to recognize the signs of God's presence and work in every corner of the world, even beyond the bounds of the visible church, while you strive to build bridges of understanding and dialogue with those who do not belong to the church or have difficulty in accepting her outlook or messages, at the same time you must loyally take on the church's fundamental duty to remain faithful to her mandate and adhere totally to the Word of God and to the magisterium's task of preserving the integral truth and unity of Catholic doctrine. This not only applies to the personal commitment of individual Jesuits. Since you are working as members of an apostolic body, you must also take care that your work and institutions always maintain a clear and explicit identity, so that the goal of your apostolic activity is neither ambiguous nor obscure. Let me emphasize one sentence of that statement, or one part of the sentence. This instruction, Benedict says, not only applies to the personal commitment of individual Jesuits. Since you are working as members of an apostolic body, you must also take care that your work and institutions always maintain a clear and explicit identity. As I understand it, Benedict means to assert that insofar as Gonzaga is an institution founded by and inspired by the Society of Jesus, the instructions to the society are by incorporation extended to the faculty and administration of Gonzaga. I'm sure many faculty members would read this passage with deep worries that it conveys an ominous tone of oppressive authoritarianism. In my view, however, it's not authoritarian, it's not oppressive, but it's completely consonant with the goals of an institution of higher education. In the work of engaging culture, we should not allow critical inquiry to become corrosive skepticism that undermines or compromises the teaching of the church. As we engage in the project of critical academic inquiry, we must articulate winsomely and powerfully the authoritative teaching of the church, even where we note, as we are obligated to do as academics, important competing positions and arguments. Most of all, we must avoid plunging the teaching of the church into confusion and ambiguity. Dr. McClelland has already pointed out that there is a fundamental problem of authority lurking in this issue. Do the official statements of the Society of Jesus and of the Roman Catholic Church have any weight in Gonzaga's conception of its fidelity to its Jesuit Catholic mission? I do not see how the statements cannot have weight. At the very least, they must be honored as contributions to a necessary conversation. As a non-Catholic member of the Gonzaga community, like Dr. McClelland, I'm not Catholic. I treasure the opportunity to serve as a co-laborer in the critical work of educating young people with a distinctive approach of Jesuit Catholic mission. In my judgment, officially sponsored performances of the Vagina Monologues or like activities abuse academic freedom and undermine Jesuit Catholic mission. Thank you.
Questions are certainly in order, or comments. If you wish to address a question or comment to one of the three of us, please feel free to do so.
I'm just curious as if there were any supporters of the Vagina Monologues that were asked before tonight.
I'll answer that question because I am a supporter of the monologues, and I was quite pleased to see it produced here. I thought it was long overdue. I've said this before, notably at meetings of this society. My own view is that the university should invite all comers for serious discussion of serious social, philosophical, theological, and practical issues. Father Mock.
Yeah, I helped write the policy for the performance of the Vagina Monologues at Marquette University in 1992, 93, when I was there. And I offered said I had no problem as long, because it was said it was going to be done within the context. So I can address that with a question, but I certainly was a supporter of doing it as the university said they were going to do it.
I can speak to that as well. I guess I have 2 points to make. The first would be, one of the things that we objected to about the spring was precisely the fact that all of the presentations were so monolithically in support of the monologues. And there wasn't an opportunity for contrary voices to have a word. And as a matter of fact, when we were planning the event today, I want to be cautious about what I say here. We did plan to involve an administrator, but it worked out that the administrator wasn't able to participate.
I was wondering if you could speak a little more on, you said that you thought that the political correctness that the Vagina Monologues exhibited a shocking bias, and you called it odd in your comments. How do you find that to be odd?
Well, partly this involves personal views that I hold, but and I'm not myself a supporter of traditional Roman Catholic views about human sexuality. For one thing, I don't think that the defining purpose of sexuality is reproduction. I think the defining purpose of human sexuality is affiliation, which sometimes occasions reproduction. But the affiliative needs of human beings are biologically based and last throughout the lifespan. But that also, I take it, puts me somewhat at odds with the monologues, for I take it that the view there is that the empowerment of women has a great deal to do with sexuality, and it seems to me that issues of political justice, access to political power and economic power are far more important, simply far more important than anything having to do with sexuality. I take also to heart some of the feminist objections to the monologues, particularly regarding the view of men that is offered there, or simply the view of human sexuality as, what shall we say, somehow monolithically non-heterosexual. So, and I have difficulties with those views. I have no difficulty at all with having these views presented on this campus or any other campus, but I realize that there's a tension here, especially in the light of several of the things that Dr. Kries and Dr. Calhoun have pointed out. Not least the existence of Catholic universities as operating under a mandatum. We do not, in fact, it seems to me, have many of the, how shall we say, degrees of freedom that a secular university would have. I myself find this very uncomfortable. In fact, I don't like it. I'm very much in favor of the complete secularization of this university, because I personally would be more comfortable with that. But, having said that, it seems to me we should have an open forum for a wide range of views.
Just a quick comment. I teach at the University of Notre Dame. There's always this issue of what's a Catholic university. I think that Catholic university defines ex corde ex classe. It's a good document. So if you don't want to have Catholic university, then you should dissolve. Why should we have a Catholic university and doing things which are not aligned with the church's teaching? This is my issue. The faculty who are not in agreement with the Catholic Church shouldn't be teaching in Catholic universities. So this is my opinion. I mean, otherwise, why should people, in our case, 50,000 a year and send university many people? They like to see that the university operates as a Catholic institution through the Catholic Church. So I think if a person does not agree with the Catholic teachings, or at least support him, shouldn't be in Catholic universities. So that's my opinion.
It's true in the academic life, as it is true in many other branches of life, that most people have the jobs they can get, not the jobs that they want. And when I used to teach at the University of Notre Dame also.
So probably you left because of...
No, I left because they were unable to offer me a permanent position, which they regretted. I'd be happy to show you the letter saying so. And which they've regretted ever since. And I will also say that the man who replaced me was not nearly as good.
You say so.
I'm not the only one who says so, so does my former chairman. In any case, when Catholic universities decide to, in fact, hire people like myself, then, of course, we are well and truly engaged in precisely the sort of issues that you're raising. I did see these issues play out at Notre Dame when I was on the faculty there, and at the time I was still a practicing Christian, and I found it very distressing. Because what I saw in the philosophy department there at the time, which was 1981 to 1985, was a group of people who had been raised in the Catholic tradition and who were running away from it as fast as they possibly could, which baffled me completely, though I wasn't a Catholic, never have been. But I have great admiration for the Catholic intellectual tradition. I didn't understand this. Why were the philosophers not doing this? Indeed, I went there with great delight because I thought, finally, I'm going to figure out what's going on in medieval philosophy. Finally, I'm going to figure out what the devil is Thomas on about. Unfortunately, the philosophers were very little help. But the issue you point to is a very real one. And it's a difficulty also for other faith-based universities. I've taught in 6 different institutions of higher education, 5 of them religious-based, 3 Catholic and 2 Protestant. And the very same dynamic operates elsewhere. As far as I can see, I do not know of an institution of higher education, whether Catholic-based or Protestant, that has resolved this issue successfully.
I understand from your point of view why it's hard to be not a Catholic and to have difficulty finding a job at a Catholic university. But what kind of confuses me as a student here, this school is expensive, and there are thousands of schools in the nation that aren't as expensive. And I see people, fellow students here, that are Catholic, that are complaining about being a Catholic university, like treating the church as this big oppressor on their intellectualization. If I was right, Vagina Monologues was pushed by students. It was not just faculty members. There were lots of students pushing for it. What I don't understand about this whole situation is if you hate Catholicism or you cannot stand it that much, why are you paying $30,000 a year to go to a Catholic university? Because the average Gonzaga student walks out of here with $30,000 worth of loans. If you want to not be at a Catholic university, there's plenty of other universities in this country. There's over 2,000 of them. And it's not like, I mean, I live in the area, and that's part of the reason I go here, but a huge majority of Gonzaga students don't live in the area. So why are you traveling halfway across the country as a non-Catholic to go to a Catholic university and then to complain about it as if like it's the worst thing in the world? That was your choice.
Would you like to reply?
I had one student graduate, I had 3 students here last year, and I think there's an element of, in this whole discussion of intellectual honesty. And do we have intellectual honesty? Many people, many parents send their children here would be shocked to hear what
Richard.
Dr. McClelland, what Dr. McClelland or Professor McClelland has stated. And I think it's interesting that Professor McClelland is working out his Christianity in the classroom, but I don't want it done at my students' expense. So I want, when I send my children here to the university, I want to know how many of the teachers are on board just in religion and philosophy. Really, it doesn't impact the mathematics and a lot of those other things. Where do they stand on these issues, and am I going to get that? And I would love to see Gonzaga submit this and put it out there so that we know we don't have to do the hard work of finding out how many Jesuits are still teaching at this university, how many Jesuits are even still in alliance with their vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, how many of them even believe that Jesus Christ really rose from the dead, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and how many times students come home to my house, I've had over 25 in the past 5 years, repeat things that have been taught to them in the classrooms here that are heretical. I mean, why is this happening? So I would like Gonzaga to be honest about what it's promoting, put it out there, let us all know, and if you're going to be Jesuit, really, in the true sense of the word, be Jesuit. And if you're not going to be Jesuit, and you're going to have people working out their issues in the classroom regarding how they feel about Christianity or sexuality, do that. But you do not find this to this degree at a lot of the good Christian colleges. You find it some, but many of the Christian colleges and a lot of the Catholic colleges, there are Catholic colleges that are standouts now. You won't find that. So intellectual honesty, even regarding the Vagina Monologues. I mean, of course you want your students to, and I've been in this work for 13 years. I know all 3 of the women you mentioned. I'd love to have Jennifer Warbeck Morris come here and address all these issues and be able to guide some of these young people that view the Vagina Monologues and give them some context. Otherwise, they walk away from here and they think, well, yeah, this isn't really that shocking. I mean, that's the common norm now. It really isn't all that shocking, is it? And parents don't even know what's going on because they're not asking their kids what's going on. And I know because they come into my office all the time. So, intellectual honesty.
I'd like to speak to that, in part to defend my colleague, Dr. McClelland, but also to defend myself. As I said, I'm not Catholic. And this goes to a comment, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, that you made about it's about whether you can be committed to the mission of the institution without being Catholic or even Christian. I think the answer to that question is absolutely. I'm not a Catholic, and yet I'm deeply committed to the mission of the university. And it required learning and getting up to speed on my part when I came here. I came here as a Christian that did not know much about the Jesuit Catholic intellectual tradition. But I thought it an obligation of my employment here to learn about it. And I'm deeply committed to it now. And I can say the same about, this may sound striking, but an agnostic, such as my colleague Dr. McClelland, is also committed to the mission of the university as it exists. And it's possible. I think I would understand, in answer to your comment, I would actually understand if Gonzaga required a statement of affiliation or a statement of faith or something like that. Our sister institution, sister and fellow Christian up the road, Whitworth, requires all faculty to write a statement of their religious views. And they don't treat it as quite a matter of setting out basic principles of commitment in a creedal sense, but they want to know, are you on board with what we're doing? And it's true that in general, Catholic institutions have not required creedal statements or creedal agreements. But it seems to me there's something in between a creedal agreement and nothing at all. And I think we could have faculty who do say that we robustly support the mission of the institution, even if we're not Catholic. I mean, I often tell people, and this sounds strange, I think, when I say this to people, they don't quite understand. I feel like a guest at Gonzaga, even though I've been here for 20 years now. And I mean I feel like a guest because this institution has values and has a tradition that long predates my coming here, even though I'm a 20-year veteran now at Gonzaga. And I have an obligation, a moral obligation, to know about that tradition and to honor it. I mean, one of the things, I'll be honest about, that bothers me about debates like this is it seems to me, you've talked about something like false advertising, which I would agree. I think buzzwords are used like social justice, Jesuit pedagogy, and of course they mean whatever the hell the person saying it wants it to mean.
But I'd like to clarify one thing. I'm not saying you all have to be Catholic. That wasn't my point. I know you, Dr. Clayton and Dr. Kries, and you're on the list for all my kids. Take them.
Actually, Dr. Clayton's over there. I'm Dr. Calhoun.
That was not my point. I don't want to.
Right. Well, I just want, I appreciate that.
Well, not my point at all. No, my point is, are our children going to come here and not be given the complete agnostic view? I mean, one of my best philosophy professors ever was agnostic. He challenged me to become the thinker that I am. But he never belittled or diminished or disregarded those views that I held as a Catholic. So that wasn't my point. I think my point was more, do we have people in line with what Gonzaga University says that it is teaching?
Right.
Does that?
Yeah, I appreciate the clarification.
Oh no, that's
Thanks.
a definite clarification. Very important because I think the philosophy department here is the strongest thing going for Gonzaga.
Thank you. Go ahead.
In response to your comment, I chose Gonzaga primarily for the mission statement that I read, and I love it here. I'm not Catholic, and I wouldn't pick anywhere else. I value my religion classes and my philosophy classes. I'm a philosophy double major. I find it extremely important to see the social justice aspects, the foreign culture aspects that we're required to take as part of our core. I also see that the importance, or why students so-called push for the Vagina Monologues, is the importance of having a voice. Yes, we are a Jesuit institution, but we're also a college campus, and if you think there's not sex going on this campus, you're stupid. And if you think that there's not people being sexually harassed or by any means, then that's also, I think, being a little naive. Yeah. And so that just for me personally, as a woman at this school who loves it, not Catholic, and wouldn't pick to go anywhere else, I still feel the need to see the big picture of the real world and have all voices being heard.
Just real fast, could I
Peter?
say something?
Just a moment. He's been trying to get into this conversation.
Yeah, I guess I'll just put my personal position out there. I am a Catholic, but being kind of a grossly liberal person, I find myself between a rock and a hard place with some other Catholics on campus who politically disagree with me. And then there are people I think who are very critical of the church and so think I'm an idiot for being a Catholic. And one of the problems I see, I think, in this debate is that sometimes there are assumptions that you're on one side or the other. You have an Orthodox, traditional Catholic view of the world, and so you're against all of these things, and you're against misunderstanding social justice, or you're an atheist liberal. And I think that is way that the debate's been going to divide among the communities, at least the way the students are viewing it. And I think that the Catholic position isn't becoming relevant to students, because either you're Catholic and you're conservative and you've accepted it your whole life, and you're going to go down that way anyway, or you're turned off by conservatism and the ideologies you acting in it, so you reject any kind of Catholic teaching from the outset. And I think that there's been a little bit of carelessness on some of the faculty's positions on campus to make this a debate a public debate amongst, the different professors who are spoken on different issues. And students who actually might have questions or be concerned about finding truth in the matter or understanding different perspectives aren't getting a fair share.
Father Maher, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, two things. First was, I think the real question here is, well, for me, whether the Vagina Monologues should have been produced. And it's interesting that the Bishop Lay Supich wrote to the priest of the diocese saying, I have been assured that this is going to be viewed in the context of Catholic moral teaching. That did not happen. So the question then is whether the questions raised by the Vagina Monologues or the Vagina Monologues themselves deserve a hearing. I know that Bishop Supich was not going to be caught on a censorship issue when everything you saw in the Vagina Monologues you can see on TV. I mean, it's been 25 years, 20 years. So really to say that the book and some of our speakers pointed at, I think the issue was the issue treated in light of Catholic moral teaching? And I'll just bring up one thing. On the issue of abortion, many of you are students here, and many of you are seniors. Have you ever come across a document called Standing with the Unborn? And that was a document that came out, I think in 2002, on March 25th, stating that in terms of social justice, abortion is a horrid injustice against women. It should be taught, proclaimed, and understood that this is an evil, and we should work with our institutions to reverse what is law. We should do it in such a way that it's not illegal, but to understand abortion as a viable choice outside of uterine pregnancies and like that, to understand that is a moral evil. Now, Vagina Monologues holds abortion as an option. And that is, so certainly I'm saying is that we can present this position, but in that area, can we look and can we present the Jesuit Catholic? And I think that's what your position is. The question here is, was the Catholic position treated? The answer was and is no. So it's not an issue whether the Vagina Monologue should be presented. The issue was it presented in the context for which it was promised? And it's interesting that the most recent General Congregation actually said to Jesuits, I think that the General Congregation recognized, I can quote the document saying, I think we've made some mistakes in this area of our presentation of human sexuality, and especially our inability to present it with the sentir cum ecclesia, to think with the mind of the church. So the question is, as you brought up in your larger comments, is how are we moving with the mind of the church in the presentation of areas of human sexuality? Now, the question is, can we use the Vagina Monologues as a reflection of what occurs in society? And the answer is yes. Yes. But it is the obligation of this university to present it in light of the fullness of Catholic teaching, or we're not a Catholic school.
I'd like to respond to that one. Never in the canon of the Vagina Monologues in 20 plus years has abortion ever been discussed in any context, nor has it been discussed in the other place produced by the VBA Foundation. So I mean, that's just factually inaccurate.
Did you had a question about the half thing, was that also inaccurate?
Yes.
No, it's in.
No, there's.
But you said it was inaccurate.
It is inaccurate. There is, Would you like to show it to me, please?
I'd have to pull it up online. I could do it eventually, but we're having a conversation.
Right,
I'll do it after the talk, sure.
Sure, but and the point I'm trying to make is it has never discussed abortion. But a lot of money raised by the production of the Vagina Monologues has gone to help women who are in situations where without help they would get abortions. And with the help of those organizations are able to make other choices, and I would submit better choices. Excuse me, I would like to finish this. Thank you. And I would say that to say that the VA Foundation is supporting abortion or that the Vagina Monologues is supporting abortion demonstrates a lack of knowledge about the foundation and the play. And I'm curious about why you feel like you should make these comments when you're demonstrating a lack of knowledge.
I'd be more than happy to. My comments were, if you can play back the tape, is the thrust of Catholic education. I brought up Standing with the Unborn because it talks about the dignity of women in a manner. If you read the document, have you read the document Standing with the Unborn?
Yes.
Okay, in it you will notice that it states an attitude about the dignity of women and in a manner that would be different than the presentation of the Vagina Monologues. My question is, not that whether the Vagina Monologues mentions abortion, my question is, how come this was not presented in the context as premised by the university? So what the Vagina Monologue says or says not about abortion is not what I'm getting at.
But you did say that the Vagina Monologues presents abortion as an option, which it does not.
The Vagina Monologues presents an image, for example, the relationships of a minor in sexual relations is in the Vagina Monologues, correct?
Yes, it does describe the rape of a child.
Okay. Did this university present that as contrary to church teaching?
I would argue yes.
I would say that that argument was very thin. And I'll stop.
Perhaps we've reached an appropriate terminus for that particular line of discussion. If there are other questions people would like to raise or comments, you're welcome to do so.
I'm just wondering if any of the three of you have any thoughts on why the original question being about whether the mission statement actually called for this kind of presentation. Why do you think those arguments were being made, basically, people trying to use church documents and so on to support that?
That's a difficult question. I think the honest answer is that, I regard my colleagues with goodwill. I've had long and rather difficult conversations with a specific colleague about who's a proponent of performance of the Vagina Monologues, especially on this question of providing a voice for women who have been silenced and also standing in solidarity. And I understand why people make those arguments. And on, I suppose I would say on practical or pragmatic grounds. In other words, I don't disagree with people on principle and say it's impossible that the Vagina Monologues can advance Jesuit Catholic mission goals. I'm not going to say that. That's too extreme. I am going to say there are much better means for doing it. There are far superior means. And I'll honestly say, and I know I'm on dangerous ground here, being not female and saying things about the voices of females. I would much prefer for us as an educational institution to help women find their own voice than to parrot the voice of Eve Ensler. And I say that as the husband of a wife and parent of 4 daughters. I would much rather them find their own voice than to reach the point where they think that the language and statements in the Vagina Monologues are their voice.
I don't know, Margaret. I mean, I think you'd have to ask them, you know, why they did it this way. My guess would be is that they were thinking that this would be controversial. They knew it was going to be controversial because of all the controversies that have erupted at other campuses, religiously affiliated campuses, and so they're trying to forestall some of the criticisms that they received anyway. But that would be my guess. I don't really know what.
I have time for one more question or comment.
During the spring of last year, there was a lot of discussion just during protesting and stuff of, I guess, students wanting to get their, well, freedom of speech, we can say what we want like that. And I guess my question is, where does freedom of speech fit into a Catholic institution, and how does that play into the discussion?
Well,
Is this question fit at all?
I think it's misleading to say that students have freedom of speech with respect to the institution. You can't, for example, shout racist epithets out in the quad and expect that the university will just say, oh, well, you're free to say whatever you want. As an institution, we maintain and project values. We have commitments that are a result of the kind of institution that we are. And I mean, Gonzaga, there's a very complex state of affairs here, is what you're getting at. Gonzaga can't tell you what you must believe or what you must write, but the idea that we're Americans, we have freedom of speech, we can do or say whatever we want, it's not true on the campus of a private institution. There are clear things that you cannot do. Mr.
Well, I'll beg your indulgence for one last comment. It seems to me that what is happening, the sort of explanation for this, is that people want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be Catholic, but they want to fit into this culture. And culture is increasingly hostile to Catholic views of sexuality, Catholic views of the sanctity of life, Catholic views on exercise of conscience in healthcare, Catholic views on euthanasia. And so places like Gonzaga exist in part to try to compromise or arbitrage this conflict between what it means to be Catholic and what it means to get ahead at General Motors or Boeing or Microsoft. If you want to get ahead in those places, you gotta toe the line of tolerance. And so there are lots of people who are selling you a bill of goods that you can be Catholic, but you don't have to be one of those uptight conservative Catholics. You can be a swinging Catholic that gets along with all the hip things that are going on in this world. And that, I would like to point out, McClelland is intellectually honest enough to say, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. Do you one or the other, but don't try to do this, sell one thing labeled as something else.
Well, I think we'll have to bring the conversation to a close. Thank you very much for your interventions and your questions.